Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. In this episode, you are going to hear from one of my colleagues and another co-conspirator, Anna Finklestein, who uses she and her pronouns. Anna is a lifelong learner committed to working towards a more liberated post-capitalist future through her work at Oberon Capital Advisors, which also happens to be where I work and how I got to know Anna a lot more closely. But before that, we met through a community called Rad Planners that you've probably heard about multiple times if you've been listening to this show. Anna's path to becoming a financial advisor includes 7 years as a history teacher. And during that time, she was simultaneously exploring solidarity economy practices and principles through her volunteer organizing with Resource Generation, the Boston Ujima Project, and Rad Planners. When Anna left teaching, she decided to craft her day job around helping people, including herself, navigate the wealth protection industry in a more informed and empowered way. Now, as a financial advisor, she helps clients understand their current financial picture and the steps needed to achieve future financial goals in a values-aligned manner. She loves grappling with questions like how much is enough? What do I get and give up by investing in Wall Street? How can I balance saving for retirement with redistribution? And Anna is someone who has helped me move along my journey and model that this type of work is possible. And so with that, I'll let you hear more. All right, welcome, Anna. I'm so happy to have you here. And usually for guests on the show, I ask them to share their money story, which, as you know, being in Resource Generation is your own personal story about the way that money has moved throughout the course of your life and your family's lives. So could you share as much or as little as you'd like to introduce yourself in your own words and share more about your money story?
First of all, I'm really excited to be here. And it's funny, I have shared my money story like 100 times. And I think every time I do it, it's different. I'm always sort of like, what's going to come out of my mouth when I say it? So my wealth predominantly originates with my dad, made possible by the systemic forces that allowed him to become a gastroenterologist and go into a very lucrative form of medicine in a private practice. On my dad's side, both his parents are immigrants from Eastern Europe, and my mom is one generation out. So her parents are the children of immigrants. And both sides of my family follow Jewish immigrant stories that are familiar to me based on talking to friends. But families came to this country fleeing pogroms and uncertainty and economic uncertainty, came to the States between the late 1800s and early 1900s. And both sides of my family started as garment factory workers and door-to-door sales people. Both my grandfathers fought in World War II, benefited from the GI Bill, which allowed both families to achieve some semblance of middle class. So a combination of I'm white, their whiteness, the assimilation of white Jews into white society were all factors that supported in on both sides, families being able to purchase their own homes. I guess the interesting lore, which I've had trouble getting to the bottom of, is my mom's family stayed solidly middle class, and my parents financially supported them in their old age. So they never achieved class ascension beyond middle class. I'm like, what is middle class now? But there was certainly no inheritance from them in terms of my own class status. But my grandfather, who fought in World War II, he became paralyzed when my dad was 12 or 13, maybe a little bit younger. Suddenly, my dad's mom, my grandmother, was the sole earner in that family and was like a social worker, a teacher, not doing jobs that were like particularly high paying. But the lore goes that she began to invest in Wall Street and was a very savvy investor and ultimately made enough money to pay for both my dad and his brother to go to college and med school, so they didn't have any debt, and then went on to make a lot of money in their respected professions. And it's a little bit unclear how my grandmother acquired any amount of wealth because she certainly didn't have any that she inherited. And she wasn't performing jobs that were particularly high income. And also, she was on a single income because her husband was disabled. So I think there are veteran benefits that they had access to. But there is sort of like this mythological, your grandmother was a Wall Street guru and was just like this individual investor who like did things and then made it specifically possible for my dad to acquire the education on the terms that he wanted to so that he could then go into this very lucrative profession. That's all to say I grew up in a what I now would consider, using resource generations language, a managerial professional class, right? So not generations of inherited wealth and very much the sensibility of children of immigrants. There was still a real emphasis on saving money, on education, some amount of like, you don't know when this is going to disappear. There's definitely taking advantage of the deals at stores, not understanding the value of buying things full price. There's stories of my grandmother, anytime she would see us, my family, she would give us all these coupons. She would buy clothing from Marshalls just to return them so that she could give us the store credit. There was so much weird maneuvering around giving and accepting money and all of that. That's all to say, I grew up taking one international vacation a year and in a two-car home. I went to a private Jewish day school. My parents paid for my college education and grad school outright, so I didn't have any college debt, and was generally raised with the sense of we're so lucky that we have access to resources. It's our job to, in the Jewish tradition of tzedakah, give away money, and we're not that rich. Currently, when I don't know exactly how old, but ultimately from my grandmother and then some money that my parents put away, I inherited about $250,000 in a brokerage and an invested account that over time grew to about 300,000 by the time I politicized around my experience of being a wealthy person through resource generation, through a few pretty important interpersonal relationships that were cross class, and then spent that down. And then a whole other story, but ended up purchasing a house to turn into a co-op with some friends, which took another big chunk of that money. Since then, I try to give away at least 10% of my income as I've been spending down my inheritance and anticipate upwards of $2-3 million. Could be less, could be more when they pass. I've been organizing my parents into giving more so that I receive less. That's part of the story.
There's so much juiciness there. I want to know more about how you became politicized based on our past conversations. I know you identify as an anti-Zionist Jew. I also want to hear more about the cross-class relationships that politicized you. So could you just share a little bit more about how you became more politicized and what that looked like for you? What were those events that really shaped you and informed your politic and your perspective?
I think at the foundation, something that I referenced in my money story is that I did grow up with a strong sense of tzedakah, or like giving, repairing the world, is a big piece of my Judaism growing up. Every year around Hanukkah, my parents would sit my sister and I down and say, this is how much money we're going to give away this year. Can you help us decide where this money should go? And I think there are a lot of ways in which that dynamic was problematic and fed into savory ideas and the nonprofit industrial complex. But I think it did give me some muscle practice in like, you give away money. That's like something that you do. And that's like part of what we believe and what is like a commitment that we have. So I think I had that, but zero class analysis. The first sort of moment of real politicization is when I was 14 or 15. I dropped out of high school and did this thing called unschooling, which is a radical form of homeschooling that I learned about. I convinced my parents. It was a messy, stupid, it like really tore the family apart, but I was deeply ideological. So number one, first hint that I am deeply ideological and that I am very stubborn when it comes to how I can better align my actions with my beliefs. But in that, I developed an analysis of ageism that was my first understanding of power and everything that I was reading, which was predominantly stuff from the 70s, a bunch of like white men talking about freeing the children with no racial or class analysis for the most part. But there was a strong analysis of children. It was the first time I was like, there is this massive injustice that nobody's talking about. And it's that like kids have no power. So that's where it started. And then my unschooling, non-traditional schooling background brought me to Portland, Oregon, because there were a bunch of people that I had met through the internet who also had very non-traditional upbringings like myself around schooling. And that was a much more class diverse group of people than the group that I had grown up with in my hometown, which was a pretty wealthy town. So it was a combination of being thrust into a new community that was really ideologically aligned, but I was now meeting people with vastly different experiences. A lot of children of commune hippies, class descendant, or solidly working class, farmers, like a real sort of variety of background stories. And I remember somebody saying to me when I was like 18, at this point, I'd moved out to Portland, Oregon, and we were talking about like things we wanted to do. And they said something like, Anna, you talk like everyone can just like travel. I don't know. I was probably talking about the value of travel. Who knows? But it was the first moment that I was like, oh, I'm being called out on something that I didn't know I was doing. And I really retreated. I got so ashamed. I spiraled. I really distanced myself in that friendship because I was like, I did something wrong. I'm bad. And I had no idea of what was happening, just that we were drifting apart as friends. Not that much longer after that, I started dating somebody who at the time was undocumented, grew up immigrant, working class, person of color, and I was thrust into what was the most like rife with, I mean, it was like every power dynamic you could imagine. And neither of us, when we started dating, had the language to talk about it, other than we just were constantly at each other because there was so much resentment and feelings and judgment on my part. I had so many judgments about their relationship to money, and it imploded. It totally imploded. But in the course of that relationship, Occupy Wall Street happened, which was a big factor in giving language to what was going on interpersonally. And then it was really in retrospect, adding in Occupy, adding in Black Lives Matter, the power of that movement, joining Resource Generation, was I then able to map retroactively all of the things that were happening in a way. And what was so cool is I got to stay in relationship with this person after we broke up, after dating for 4 years, that I think in a lot of ways allowed us to make right some of the ways in which the injustices of our world played out in the relationship and how specifically I enacted white supremacist, classist, problematic things. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely a winding road, but I would say that was a very particularly influential interpersonal relationship. And I think more broadly, just leaving the town that I had grown up in and just generally having deeper friendships with people who had vastly different life experiences.
I'm like, wow, that's so special that you were able to continue to still have that relationship and move towards repair. I'm curious what that has looked like for you, and then also thinking through how you became involved in the work around Free Palestine and what's happened recently, reading the headlines, the recent bombing that just happened in the midst of a so-called ceasefire, which obviously is not true. Yeah, just also want to make space for like, I'm feeling a lot of grief around that as someone organizing for Palestinian liberation, and just want to make space for anything you're feeling or just how you came into that work as well.
Yeah, thanks for lifting that up. I'm feeling immense heaviness, especially given that it was specifically very Jewish rhetoric that served as the foundation for the way that I relate to giving and to class. I actually think that there's so much power that Jewish tradition offers and has offered me in my journey towards repair. And so it feels all the more so painful that Zionism is also a part of my tradition. It's not really, I mean, it is. It's become a part of it. It didn't have to be, but it is. And so I think there's a lot of grief. And yeah, it's true that I grew up in a Zionist community. I went to a Zionist day school. I was lucky in terms of my own learning of Zionism that my parents were not the most Zionist people around. They were probably the least Zionist people around. I don't think that was particularly ideological. I think it was more that my parents struggled to fit in the community socially, and I think they saw Zionism as just another piece of the status quo that they didn't quite understand. They had both been to Israel. They didn't feel the same sort of connection that I think they saw around them. I think my parents, the way that they are is rather than try to be what they see around them, they really reject it, and they're like, "We're not like other people." And I think, to be honest, I think for no reason other than their own insecurities and relationship to community. I don't know, maybe they'll listen to this and be frustrated that I'm saying it, but I think there was a sense of like, "We don't do that. We don't watch sports. We're not that into Israel. We're sort of like on the edge of we're on the periphery of everything." All to say, I didn't have as much unlearning to do as other people. I think that coming to understand my whiteness and my wealth forced me to understand my Jewishness and the ways in which my Jewishness impacts my whiteness and my experience of wealth. And that was over many years. That was probably the longest journey that sort of was woven throughout developing an analysis of power, which is that Zionism is antithetical to liberation because of the way that it works with whiteness and with domination and with colonialism. I remember, yeah, it feels like mush. I do not have a strong narrative of like when it happened and what happened first, but I do think there was first a sense of not immediate defensiveness around Zionism being challenged because I wasn't raised in the most Zionist household. Yeah, I do think that it was a combination of over time immersing myself in a more racially and class diverse community and having different inputs and learning new things, right? And suddenly I was not just receiving a Jewish day school history of the state of Israel. With the help of people around me, I was able to take in new information about what's true and what has been true that changed my mind.
Thanks so much. It feels like mush. It just feels really relatable in, mapping our own journeys and like finding our ways into becoming the people that we are now. And probably 10 years from now, it'll feel the same of like, I don't know, it was mushy. And, I know that we met through this group called Radical Planners. And through that, it's financial professionals working to center a just transition in their work. And so I'm very curious both how you made the shift from being a history teacher, especially now that I'm learning this lore of you went through a totally different educational process. So I want to get there. And before we get there, would love to just hear about how you think about a just transition and how you center that in your work, especially in terms of navigating what is your work to do or the role that you want to play in the broader movement towards collective liberation.
Just a casual question. Just transition to me is the best reflection that I've seen or learned about of the contradiction of building a new thing when you're living under the old thing. So, how do you both work towards the world we're trying to live in while also accounting for what's true about the world now? And I think that Just Transition attempts to grapple with that by offering a multifaceted approach to being living now while also maintaining hope for a future. That feels very abstract, but that is ultimately what feels true. And when it's applied to the financial industry, whether it's investing or giving or money, that also feels true. It's like, how are we investing both in investing in the broader sense in the world that we're trying to build and maintaining hope while also being thoughtful and aware of what is needed to keep people safe now, which sometimes seems like or feels like it's in contradiction to that future vision.
How do you think about the role of, spoiler alert for listeners, Anna and I work together? If that hasn't been clarified yet. And we both work as financial advisors, wealth managers, financial professionals in this space. So, Anna, how do you think about the role of finance when it comes to a just transition, both as something that can be remolded into something different and also something that's been used as to quote the words of Audre Lorde, a master's tool?
Yeah, I hate finance I love my job, but I hate finance. I don't know if I'm in the minority here, but what we talk about in finance spaces and radical finance spaces when we think about just transition, we often posit or we put community investments as being on the build side of the just transition, building the new world. And I actually don't think that's true. Like for me, any investment, like in my world that I'm trying to build, investments don't exist. There isn't such an injustice of capital allocation, of resource allocation that you need to do. Like to me, I think of that work as still being harm reduction, which makes engaging with shareholder campaigns, which is often positioned in the resist end of just transition. I'm like, that doesn't even count. That's like off the charts. And I don't mean to devalue or invalidate the work that people are doing there. I think there's a rationale there, there's a strategy. It's not where I want to put my energy, but I respect it. And yet I'm like, it's all harm reduction. This whole industry, even when we make it in its most radical form, to me still feels like harm reduction because it is trying to in small and big ways rectify and make better now a world that is deeply fucked up. Right. And I don't know. I've had conversations with Jordan and I. We work with two other colleagues at this firm, and one of them, Leo, has pushed me on this. And I think there are arguments to be made that challenge what I just shared. But all to say, when I think about financial services and this industry, even in its most radical state, I think of it as the work of resist and of moving money now to have impacts now. While maybe I guess you could make the argument that some of the most like democratically governed community loan funds are doing some of the doing work of creating different power structures around resource allocation. But I think the very need for investments, the concept of investments that are not mutual aid investments, meaning they're not happening within the community, they're coming from the outside, that to me means that we are very far still from the vision that we're trying to create, which, like, obviously, and that's totally okay. But I don't remember what your original question was. That's me musing on it, though.
I love it. I love the poetic waxing of harm reduction as it relates to finance. And it makes me think about painting a really abstract painting and starting with something that's just like random shapes and then filling in the colors. And we don't actually know exactly how everything is going to play out, but starting to fill in the details with finance being a way to move resources, reallocate the resources, and is not the end goal or the end state. Like the end state is we all get to have our needs met without relying on this like capital centric way in which wealth is now hoarded or allocated. So I'm curious, Anna, as someone who came into this work, just like myself, we both were on this track within Radical Planners called becoming a radical advisor. That was one of the ways that I was like, wow, I had no idea people even talked about this or thought about this or that this was possible. First, I'm like, ooh, as someone who started on a very untraditional education path, what made you want to be a history teacher? And what made you make another shift into more radical finance?
The joke is that, like, in 5 years, I'm gonna, like, go to medical school and become a doctor. The sort of, like, running joke in close circles is sort of like and I had a 3-year job in between teaching and becoming a radical advisor that was more in the philanthropic direction. So in some ways, I feel like I've had 3 careers. My story, it is quite ironic that I ended up spending more time in a high school, having not gone to high school or having done 1 year in high school. I left high school. I became an ardent I mentioned that was the site of my first kind of power analysis, and so I was a school abolitionist, and I believed that kids should be freed from the schools. Over time, as I politicized, as I kind of, like, grew into a different understanding of the world vis-a-vis other power dynamics, I began to see the ways in which my vision for school abolition did not take into account a lot of other social forces and realities that eliminating schools, just simply eliminating schools, actually don't solve. And so it brought me to back to school to think of, well, what are the ways to be addressing some of these power dynamics within the system that is. So I think there was a certain amount of reform. I was getting a lesson in to what extent do you work within the system to change it? To what extent do you just create alternatives? How do sometimes the discourse and rhetoric of creating alternatives fail to account for what is true in this moment? I think it really was sort of like what's the just transition for schooling? And I can talk. I mean, I think I'm making some assumptions about the audience here that people maybe could guess some of the critiques that I had of schooling. I think that would be a whole other podcast, but that realization brought me back to schools thinking I should be working in schools. And so I thought, there are some pretty experimental school within a school models that exist in public schooling. I became an advocate of public schooling once I had an analysis of class and da, da, da. So I was like, cool, I'm going to get into public schools and be working at some of the experimental programs that are working with young people around like internship project based education. In order to do that in a public school, I needed to be licensed. And in order to be licensed, I had to pick a subject matter in order to be licensed in. I was an undergrad, a history major. I'm not going to go into why exactly, but I was. So history education was the license that I pursued for no other reason than I wanted to be in schools. I didn't intend to teach history, but I needed a license. And it's really hard to tell the story in the shortened version, but I loved it and also could never shake the feeling that I was harming young people more than I was supporting them in the form of our grading system, the level of competition, the ideas about the world that while I both had the opportunity to teach more radical history because I was in control of the curriculum, it also always felt like never enough. I burnt out after 7 years of not making very much money, working really, really hard, feeling like I didn't know if I was doing a good thing, and deciding that needed more time to devote to community and to other pieces of my life. Ultimately, that felt more important. So I left teaching. It was primarily a capacity issue. And my little unschooler self being like, why are you in a classroom doing this thing? I could never, I didn't quite reconcile that. And it was just too tiring to keep doing. So I left and began a bit of a soul searching. I worked for a few years at Act Blue, which is like the fundraising platform for the Democratic Party. And I worked in their nonprofit side. And I guess what brought me to money ultimately was, I think, a few things. One is because of my proximity to wealth, because of my class background, when I was starting to do community organizing, volunteer community organizing on the side as I was teaching, I most often found myself in resource mobilizing roles. So raising money, moving money. I believed that that was an important place for me to be. And I've always been attracted to taboos. I was really fascinated specifically with wealthy people and our relationships to money and why people talked about it in the ways that they did and why people omitted things in the ways that they did and what allowed some people to give away all their money and some people to hoard it. I think I was fascinated by the psychology seems too reductive, but I think it was the opaqueness of money, specifically among wealthy people, among myself, my family members. And so I remember asking somebody, what can I do that I just want to like talk to rich people about their money and grapple with some of these big questions? And maybe it's my dad. He's like, you could be a financial advisor. And we both laughed because it's like my math education ended in ninth grade, you know? And then I was really lucky enough to do some volunteer community organizing with Ujima, a democratically run loan fund in Boston, where I met our colleague Hendrik Berry. This was like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And that was in the process of me trying to figure out like what is drawing me to working with and around money for liberation and what could that look like. Brought me to Ujima. Ujima brought me to Hendrix. Hendrix brought me to Rad Planners, and the rest is history.
Mm, it's so beautiful. I love it. Any theories that you want to share about why money is such a taboo topic or why people relate to money the way they do? I mean, I have my own theories. We also know systemic oppression is at play, but anything you want to share?
Because we live under capitalism, under a specific brand of racialized late stage capitalism, money represents material, existential safety, and security. It's everything. It is simply who you are born to and or who you marry, who you fuck, who you love that predicts whether you have safety and security. That's wild. And I think we all know that's wild, but also we're taught that that's like gravity. It's like a natural process. And I think wealthy people in particular, I mean, I'm not poor, I'm not working class, so I don't know for sure, but my understanding is that poor working class people have to talk about money, or if not money, they have to talk about care. It's only rich people who can pretend for the time being that care is this like private, quiet thing that I think carries a lot of shame and guilt. I'd like to believe, at least for myself, that there are underpinnings of confusion about why the world is the way that it is. But I think money, in the way that it informs survival and care, and the way that it's related to love and romance and family systems that are so complicated, I think our cultural stories about those things, about love, about money, about work, are all so wrong. I think that that all contributes to a sense of like, for rich people specifically, not knowing how to talk about it, not wanting to talk about it, being really afraid of it, being afraid of losing it, being afraid of having it, being stuck in family systems because of wealth and an obligation. And um, I don't know. I feel like I'm going to listen back to this and maybe be like, whoa, that was really like, you did not, you missed something glaring. But I think there are threads of truth, at least to my experience and what I've just shared.
Yeah. And the worthiness too around feeling like a burden, being a burden, burdensome, even the way that poor and working class people have been scapegoated against as being a burden on our tax dollars. Like it runs the gamut in our cultural narratives. And I think there's a lot there that you touched on. It is really fascinating in hearing how your religion had a huge influence too on like your relationship to wealth redistribution and how you entered this work. I have questions I want to ask you about like the role of investing, but before we move into that, yeah, I'm just curious. I think so much about what does repair look like through the lens of a legacy? Part of the reason I came into this work is I wanted to heal my own familial legacy. I have many greats, hundreds of years ago, grandparents that were responsible for colonizing part of what's so-called Western Florida, grandparents who lived in the South and had plantations, and those plantations created trust funds for their children. And that's something that has affected me to this day. And so I think about what does it look like to create a different story and to both, honor the fact that these are our ancestors and that what's true for them doesn't have to be true for us. And we get to repair that through our actions today. So yeah, curious for you. What does it look like to show up in relationship to your religion and to Jewish community as an anti-Zionist Jew?
I think it's a great question. I think that for many Jews, the lack of the history of oppression and displacement has contributed to a story that there is nothing to make reparations on or for beyond. I think for folks who have a political understanding of themselves, if they're white as white Jews, there is a sense of like, okay, I understand the complicity that as a white person I have to reparations, but that's in spite of my Jewishness, not because of it, right? There's something really different there. Certainly when I think about what you just shared about your story, I'm like, yeah, my family's story is so different. Like my family fled, like even questions of reconnecting with land and homeland, like I don't have that. And I think part of that is why Israel and the state of Israel has been such a seductive story for so many Jews, is because it represents something that, at least for Ashkenazi Jew, at least my family's lineage, there is no home, there is no ground that is more mine. And I think about that even in the context of land back. Yeah, I'm like both like really here for it. And it's confusing as somebody who doesn't have ancestral home. And I think that with the ongoing genocide and the entire history of the state of Israel, that is the closest that I get to relating my, that is the space where as a Jew, as a white Jew, as a Jewish American whose tax dollars is funding the genocide in Gaza and the displacement and in the West Bank, I have a responsibility as somebody who holds those identities to think really deeply about what it means to resist and fight genocide in this moment in that is being done in my name. Not to be totally cliche, but yeah, I mean, all of those things are at the forefront and in my core around what it means to be an anti-Zionist Jew. What feels different about that is prior to identifying as an anti-Zionist, again, I could understand myself as implicated as a white person in white supremacy, but that had no relationship to my Judaism. And in fact, again, it was sort of like despite. And now, and as I've politicized around the colonial settler project that is the state of Israel, I think I have a really different relationship to my Jewishness in a way that's made it at points really hard to be Jewish.
Yeah, that feels really real and still honoring your culture and your spirituality while it not being used as a tool or a mechanism to contribute or instigate genocide. It's hard. It's really hard to be in multicultural and interfaith spaces too. Um, Anything else that you want to share about that?
Yeah, I guess I'll share one thing sort of anecdotally about my experience in a Jewish day school, which was a private education for 9 years, a really small school, a conservative Jewish school. I was born in 1990, so I was there in the 90s and early 2000s. And I think, at least at institutions, that school that I went to, things have changed. But at the time that I was there, we certainly did not, we were told that Palestinians didn't exist, which I think that is a narrative that is still being taught, although I think less so and less so given the news cycle and the way that language has changed out in the world. But I also think we were told, and I think these things are related and important, that when we filled out demographic information and we were told that we could either put white or other and put Jewish in as our racial identity. And there's a few things that are hard about that. One is there were students of color at that school, and I don't think that they were considered in that calculation. I think they were completely erased in that moment because it was like, well, you're white, but you also could. But the idea that there could be that racially we were something else or ambiguous, I think, paired with a really strong Zionist education is really confusing. And I share that one because I think that's shifting in mainstream Jewish institutions in this country. I think that at that moment that does not happen as much, but I think I feel very aware of how my understanding of myself and my class and my relationship to this country and land felt confusing as a child.
And a lot of what you're talking about too, I know that there's differences and nuance, but reminds me about just talking about the indigenous genocide that happened here in so-called America and how we're taught that those cultures, those people are no longer around, and that is absolutely untrue. And those people are still doing land back work, still doing land rematriation work, and the resistance continues, and that is a shared resistance with Palestine as well. And on a totally different note, bringing it to of our work in terms of the day-to-day working within the finance industry, I'm curious how you think about enoughness. I know that's something that comes up in a lot of conversations, especially even now, we are experiencing so many crises. We're seeing social programs just get slashed by the federal government. How do you orient for yourself around how much is enough? And like, how do you think about risk and return?
I think about enoughness less conservatively with myself than I do with clients, in part because the regulators, but I do think for myself, I have a pretty embodied sense that we're like hurtling collectively towards massive implosion, like environmental disaster, war. Like there's just sort of a very small part of me that it's not that I feel hopeless, but I think I feel like this is our last hope. What we do now is like this is all we have. I think there is a sense of if we don't go big now, we're really done, or we're done anyway, whatever that means. But that for me to have integrity in this moment in time for myself means if you put my numbers into the financial planning software that we use with clients, it says I have a 0% probability of success of having money at the end of my life. And I actually, number one, don't believe that that's true. Number one, I have some information about likely inheritance. And also, I have my own issues with that software. But I think what's true is that I make decisions that I think certainly traditional finance people, but even non-finance people might say are risky. And I think to me, there's just a sense of it's riskier not to do those things. It's riskier to depend on financial returns from Wall Street. It's riskier to hoard money. It's riskier to make decisions based on my own sense of personal security than it is to give my money away, than it is to invest in community, than it is to share the resources that I have. And I say all this with the very obvious caveat that I have a pretty substantial safety net in a very traditional sense. I say this and I'm like, eye roll, like easy for me to say. So I want you to know that I have that awareness. And I think if I didn't have that kind of safety net, I would be making very different choices. Well, not necessarily, but probably. That's all to say that I think in general, feel like the enough question is the best question in the world, and it's also the worst question in the world. It's unanswerable. It gets us stuck. It also is super generative. It gets us talking about what we actually need to live and the alternative structures of support and safety that we have. I think that personally, where I'm interested in taking that question is more about how am I contributing towards my belief in the communization of care? Personally, for me, it means not getting married. It means thinking about partnership in expansive ways. It means, as I think about whether I want to have a kid, thinking about non normative parenting structures. Those are the questions that I'm interested in. I'm sort of like, yeah, what's enough? I don't know. Every day is a little bit different. I throw some numbers into our financial planning software and I'm like, well, that doesn't really make sense. Well, I guess I'll fund my Roth 50% this year, why not next year? I don't know. I mean, to some extent, there is an amount of like vibe gut check based on my own internal sense of security and safety in my orbit with the sort of underlying, very present known fact, which is that I have a strong safety net in a traditional sense to catch me, my parents. I'm close to my biological parents. I'm set to inherit things. All the things are there for me to take the kinds of risks that I take.
I think what's so ironic about it too is, well, there's two things. One, all of the assumptions in the software that we use are based on historical data and then the macroeconomic conditions of today. I don't believe it's factoring in mass extinction events and climate collapse and all of these things that maybe, yes, people have lived through and also not to the degree in which we're living through now. So it's kind of like we're like staring into this like magic eight ball being like, fuck it, but we don't actually, there's no way to know. And I think so much of that too is related to creating those other forms of safety, which you named, which come through relationality and trust and the people in proximity near us and how we can collectivize that care, which is something that poor working class people, systemically oppressed people have always, always done. It's like, oh, wait, we're actually just practicing the wisdom that's been true for millennia.
Well, the wild thing is like 100% yes. And imagine if those structures of care could actually be resourced with the immense amount of resources that collectively we have that are just completely inequitably reallocated and distributed. Like it's like, yes, there is so many alternative systems that have been practiced that are being practiced. And imagine if there was a way to actually infuse those systems with the richness of the world that we have. I mean, it just is like the possibilities feel endless and it's so sad. Which I think brings me back to this idea of naturalization, like the naturalization of inheritance, of legacy, of wealth, of all of these things that are like, this is just the way that it is. The naturalization of historic returns and market trends being the predictor of the future is all based on an assumption that this is just what is the natural cycles of capitalism, the cycle, the market. It goes up, it goes down, stay in it long term. Eventually, it's going to trend up. All of these ideas are specifically in the financial industry sector, which is the industry that contributes to the continued hoarding of these resources, are so brainwashed by this idea that everything that we know to be true is false. It's like a law of nature, It's wild to me.
Yes. And capitalism, really, in its form, has only been around for 600 years, y'all. It's not been around that long if we think about human history, and way before the billions and trillions of years in which the earth has been forming and creating the conditions that make it possible for us to even live today, as you know, being a history teacher. And nature has so much to teach us and how we steward resources, and indigeneity already has these stories, these practices across cultures, across people. And I think we know this to be true, that we can learn from nature. And if we actually use that to influence how we think about resource allocation and markets, air quotes, markets, it would be so much more generative and so much more sustainable.
I just have a feeling, maybe not anyone listening to this podcast, but I've been faced, I'm sure, Jordan, you have too, with what I feel like we're talking about might seem like a romanticization or a like, at the very least, a really harsh critique without necessarily clarity of the quote, what's better. I think it's really easy for people who are capitalists or really anyone to say, well, totally, like this is clearly not working, but what's better? What's your alternative? This example of socialized blah blah or communalized blah blah didn't work. I think that also comes up around in the movement for Palestinian liberation. There's such an element of like, well, you come in here critiquing everything and wanting to tear it down, but what's your solution, right? Are you offering for a one state or a two state? How are we going to fix this? Okay, you don't like capitalism? Well, did you see how, so and so tried communism? And it's like, it makes me so frustrated because I'm like, the idea that you need to have a solution polished and figured out in order to get people to move from the old thing is impossible. It's unfair. It's unreasonable. The idea that negation and critique isn't a valuable, that anger isn't a valuable source of wisdom and power that like brings like-minded people together to start creating alternatives. I'm just like, okay, no, we get to have this. I don't know what's better. I don't know how we get there. I have some ideas, or I have some ideas about what might be better. I don't know how we get there. But the alternative is to not try. The alternative is to say, well, it could be worse, so let's not try. That line of argumentation really has always bothered me because that is the quickest way to shut down a conversation. It's not fair, and I think it delegitimizes the value of critique, of anger, of grief, and specifically of how those things play a role in imagining a different and better world.
Yes. And the frameworks, like, is there a perfect solution with every, like, here's our step-by-step guide of how to completely transform the world? Obviously not. And there are frameworks like a just transition. There are frameworks that have been created by poor and working class people in indigenous societies. And I mean, look at the Zapatistas and Chiapas, look at the MST in Brazil and across the global South. There are real examples of people doing it differently that maybe wouldn't work in air quotes across all cultures in the global world. But what's the risk of not trying? Oh, right. We just continue to extract from our planet until it's inhospitable, and the ultra wealthy of us get to go to space.
Right. I mean, I think you asked how I think about risk and return. That is a big part of that definition. And it's okay that there are contradictions, especially that's another sort of talking point that gets weaponized is this, yeah, even evoking indigeneity is complex. There's contradictions and how to understand a world in which lots of people have moved for a very long time and a world of being in right relationship with indigenous peoples on the land that you're on. I think that we're not in a world where everyone, to even my story about, I don't have a place to go back to. I don't have a place that I'm indigenous to. Depends on how you define indigeneity. Yes, and there is like wisdom in indigeneity. There is land back. There is a future where those things can be true. And I think sometimes the seeming contradictions can feel like we're doing something wrong because there are contradictions or there are tensions. And I don't know. I think that the left, it's back to also the just transition of living in the world that is while creating the world that you want to live in is inherently contradictory. I think that's like, okay, how do you sort of like, for me, I think it's been a personal project. How do I get comfortable with contradiction? Working in the financial sector, it's rife with contradictions. But does that mean that there's a moral judgment on those contradictions? Not necessarily.
Yeah, well, also you're naming the contradictions and also naming like contradictions also exist under the conditions we're living in today. But on the topic of the contradictions, one big contradiction is investing. And what can that even look like through the lens of a solidarity economy, through the lens of a just transition? I see you. Head shakes, head shakes in many directions. And I know you're also a part of a working group that's centered on solidarity, economy, and transformative investing. And one of the frameworks that Resource Generation has shared is what's called transformative investment principles, TIPS. Can you share a little bit more about what that framework is and how you think about it, both in your own process as an individual and as an advisor?
TIPS stands for Transformative Investment Principles, and it came out of work that a bunch of folks associated with Resource Generation did in relationship with other people in the ecosystem. That basically was Resource Generation's first attempt to formalize some kind of philosophy around investing because it had previously only done that around redistribution. Resource Generation is an organization that works with young people with access to wealth to help redistribute land, power, and wealth. And I think that before the tips were released, that was centering entirely around full redistribution, so gifting. And Resource Generation has done amazing, incredible things around organizing young people to give away a lot of money. And I think my understanding is that what became clear over time is that there needed to be some support framework to offer around investments because people were inevitably not giving away all of their money. They still had money in retirement accounts or otherwise didn't entirely spend down inherited invested accounts because they had access to family resources that were invested, and there were opportunities to organize family members to invest differently who are maybe not in a position or ready to give it all away. There also was asks by BIPOC-led organizations on the ground doing solidarity economy work. We need investment capital. We don't just need donation capital. So between being responsive to the needs of people that they were in relationship with in the space and the realities of their demographic, of their constituency, the need for some kind of language or framework around investing became clear. So the tips are a series of statements that are about reducing extraction in personal investments and increasing community power and capacity for governance through investment capital. And now they exist as a guidance with lots of room for interpretation, but have really created space at Resource Generation, at least for this working group to exist, for there to be programming, financial literacy, political ed around Wall Street, where Wall Street comes from, and the alternatives that are being dreamed up, worked on, funded to create alternatives to simply philanthropic, nonprofit industrial complex model.
And for folks who are like, why would you ever invest when you can give? We've talked about this a little bit in other episodes. There will be more specific episodes around what integrated capital is and can look like. But it also allows for more accessible lines of credit for capital projects that take multitude of millions of dollars to get going. And so just a few examples are land rematriation projects, asset rematriation projects. And so it's pairing the wealth redistribution with really patient concessionary return investments. And thank you, Anna, for touching on that. I know TIPS has been a huge part of how I have been able to move and divest more from what would otherwise be in Wall Street extractive industries. Anna, I always love our conversations, and I know we covered a lot. And I want to make space for any other patterns, trends, things that you're noticing in the ecosystem, or phrased in another way. If you had a magic wand and you could wish that listeners of this show already knew about something, what would you want to share with them?
I think something that I feel compelled to say in response to that question is less about what I want other people to be thinking about and more what I feel like I'm paying attention to more now. And that is, I've mentioned it a few points throughout this conversation around communal care, the things that are alternatives to the private sphere of specifically we're talking about wealth in this conversation, but I think something that I'm thinking a lot about is on an internal level and in my own immediate life, noticing one, the things that feel natural to me that have been naturalized, things like inheritance or market value or romantic relationships across the spectrum, and start to begin to see how these things are constructed and serve the ways in which they are beneficial and have served me well, and the ways in which they maybe have served me well, but not the world well, or the ways in which they just haven't served anyone well. And to begin to think about every opportunity for collectivized processes, resources, property, business, cooperatives. I'm thinking a lot about cooperatives. The way that I think about solidarity economy investing in a slightly more zoomed out lens is thinking about how do we make more things owned by more people who are impacted by those things? So how do we make sure governance processes are more democratic? How do we make sure that property is held in land trusts or in cooperative networks? How do we make sure our businesses are doing all of those things? And also, how are we thinking about our own personal practices and how the way that we love and care is hoarded or available? And then be really real about the ways that capitalism creates the conditions that make it really hard to do those things. I'm just feeling passionate about the thing that I'm feeling passionate about right now, which is making visible all the assumptions that we make that lead us to a more private and privatized life. And I think especially the ways in which rich people are set up to do that and get to do that and are benefited by doing that.
Ooh, yes. I love ending on that note. And just want to say thank you so much, Anna. You shared so many things so vulnerably. You are someone I look up to and really admire, and just appreciate you sharing this part of yourself with the public. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for receiving all of this. I'm excited for my future self to learn something from my past self or vice versa.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.